Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. There exists a stretch of road few dare to travel after dark. Locals whisper of the eerie silence that clings to the asphalt, of the travelers who vanish without a trace. They say the highway holds a dark secret, haunted by a ghostly woman whose beauty lures the unsuspecting into her web of terror. Her name, lost to time, is known only by the screams that echo through the night. This is the story of how she died, and why she haunts the highway still. The night was suffocating, the air thick with humidity as Marcus sped down the empty stretch of highway. His hands clenched the steering wheel, his heart racing from the adrenaline that coursed through his veins. He wasn't supposed to be on this road. Not after what happened years ago. But something had drawn him back, something he couldn't explain. As the trees passed his window, his thoughts drifted to her. The woman. It had been years since that fateful night, but her face, her sorrowful eyes, and the way she died had haunted his dreams ever since. He shook his head, trying to push the memories away, but she wouldn't let him forget. Years before the haunting began, she was known for her beauty. Amelia Green was a woman of grace and poise, with long dark hair that flowed like silk and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. People in her small town often whispered about her, some envious, others curious about the sadness that lingered behind her perfect smile. Amelia had been engaged to a wealthy businessman, a match that everyone in town praised. But beneath the surface, their relationship was far from perfect. Her fiancé, Marcus, was a man with a temper, prone to fits of jealousy and control. The town didn't know about the nights Amelia spent crying in her room, or the bruises she covered with long sleeves and scarves. One night, after an argument that spiraled out of control, Amelia made a decision. She couldn't live her life shackled to a man who made her feel like a prisoner. That evening, she packed a small bag and drove down Highway 3, hoping to escape the life that had been chosen for her, but she never made it. As Amelia's car sped down the empty road, she felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The moonlight illuminated the way forward, but the dark woods on either side of the highway felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on her. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. Her mind raced as she tried to think of her next move. Would she go to a friend's house? Or leave the state entirely? All she knew was that she needed to start fresh. Away from Marcus and the life that had slowly suffocated her spirit, but as she drove, her car's engine began to sputter. Panic washed over her as she realized her tank was nearly empty. She hadn't stopped for gas in her haste to escape. The car rolled to a stop on the side of the highway, the engine dead. Amelia sat in the dark, her heart pounding in her chest. She was miles away from the nearest town, with no cell phone signal and no one to help. She stepped out of the car, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle. Hours passed, and not a single car came, and then, she heard the familiar sound of an engine. Relief washed over her as headlights appeared in the distance. She waved frantically. Praying the driver would stop, the car slowed and came to a halt a few feet away from her. The window rolled down, and to her horror, it was Marcus. "Amelia," he called, his voice eerily calm. "What are you doing out here?" Her blood turned to ice as he stepped out of the car and walked toward her. "You can't leave me," he whispered, his voice low and threatening. "You're mine." Before she could react, Marcus grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the edge of the road. She struggled, her screams piercing the night, but live her life shackled to a man who made her feel like a prisoner. That evening, she packed a small bag and drove down Highway 3, hoping to escape the life that had been chosen for her, but she never made it. As Amelia's car sped down the empty road, she felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The moonlight illuminated the way forward, but the dark woods on either side of the highway felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on her. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. Her mind raced as she tried to think of her next move. Would she go to a friend's house? Or leave the state entirely? All she knew was that she needed to start fresh. Away from Marcus and the life that had slowly suffocated her spirit, but as she drove, her car's engine began to sputter. Panic washed over her as she realized her tank was nearly empty. She hadn't stopped for gas in her haste to escape. The car rolled to a stop on the side of the highway, the engine dead. Amelia sat in the dark, her heart pounding in her chest. She was miles away from the nearest town, with no cell phone signal and no one to help. She stepped out of the car, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle. Hours passed, and not a single car came, and then, she heard the familiar sound of an engine. Relief washed over her as headlights appeared in the distance. She waved frantically. Praying the driver would stop, the car slowed and came to a halt a few feet away from her. The window rolled down, and to her horror, it was Marcus. "Amelia," he called, his voice eerily calm. "What are you doing out here?" Her blood turned to ice as he stepped out of the car and walked toward her. "You can't leave me," he whispered, his voice low and threatening. "You're mine." Before she could react, Marcus grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the edge of the road. She struggled, her screams piercing the night, but there was ghostly hands reached for him, her touch cold and unforgiving. She dragged him out of the car, pulling him toward the same spot where she had died. His screams echoed through the night, but no one came to help. Just like her, by morning, Marcus was gone. His car was found abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of him. Only the smell of decay lingered in the air, and the soft whispers of a woman long dead. Highway remains haunted to this day, a cursed stretch of road where travelers vanish without a trace. They say if you drive it late at night, you might catch a glimpse of her, Amelia, standing by the side of the road, her sorrowful eyes pleading for help. But don't stop, because once you do, she'll drag you into her world of torment, and you'll never leave the highway again. The moon was a mere sliver, casting just enough light to make out the jagged edges of the road as Marcus raced down highway. His hands were shaking, knuckles white against the wheel. He could still see her. He had always seen her, Amelia, the ghostly figure of his past, standing by the side of the road like she had been waiting all these years. The whispers had started a week before. At first, faint. Then louder. Eerier. His dreams, once dominated by fragmented guilt, had turned into a vivid, suffocating nightmare of flesh rotting, bones snapping, her face, her beautiful face, twisting into a grotesque mask. The Amelia he had killed was dead. But the thing haunting him, it was something else. Something far worse. As Marcus sped through the night, headlights cutting through the murk, the smell hit him, putrid and thick, like rotting meat festering in the damp heat. He gagged, rolling down the window, only to find the smell coming from inside the car. His heart raced, out of instinct, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. She was there. Not the woman he had known. Her eyes were hollow, her face a mask of decay. Flesh hung from her bones, dark streaks of blood running down her sunken cheeks. Her lips peeled back into a grotesque smile, revealing blackened teeth, as she whispered his name, the sound so unnatural it sent cold sweat trickling down his spine, Marcus. He slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. His breath came in ragged gasps, eyes darting around the empty highway. She was gone. He blinked, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment, praying it was all in his mind. When he opened them again, she stood in front of the car. Her once beautiful gown now tattered and stained with blood, skin hanging in loose strips, bones poking through raw patches of decay. The headlights only illuminated half her face, the rest shrouded in shadow, but those eyes, they still shone with sorrow, anger, and something far more malicious, as if caught in an unseen current. A low, guttural sound emanated from her chest, a mix between a sob and a growl. "Did you think you could escape me, Marcus?" Her voice was no longer the soft, melodic tone he once loved. It had become something dark, twisted, as though dragged from the depths of the grave. The car's engine stalled. Marcus's pulse quickened. The air grew thick, choking him, each breath harder to take than the last. The dashboard lights flickered and went out. Now the darkness was absolute. He tried to move, to turn the ignition, to get away from the horror that stood before him, but his limbs refused to obey. Her sorrowful eyes held him captive. He felt the temperature around him plummet, the cold settling deep into his bones, freezing him in place. The glass of the windshield began to fog, but not from heat, from an icy breath. Her breath. Amelia raised her hand slowly, one decaying finger pointing directly at him. "You did this to me," she whispered. Her voice was a death rattle, like bones scraping against stone. "Now, you'll join me." A cold hand clamped down on Marcus's shoulder. He let out a scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The world around him seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself was crumbling. Amelia's face pressed against the driver's side window, her skin peeling, revealing a mass of maggots squirming beneath the surface. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, were now hollow pits of darkness, her smile a grotesque mimicry of human emotion. Marcus fumbled with the door, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. A lone traveler, Sarah, was making her way home after a long shift at the diner. She knew about the rumors surrounding the road, who didn't? But she had driven this way 100 times and nothing had ever happened to her. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, something that began to slow, sputtering as the engine struggled. Panic shot through her as she glanced down at the dashboard. Full tank, no engine lights. But still, the car came to a complete stop. She sat in the eerie stillness, her hands gripping the wheel, knuckles white. There was no sound, no chirping of crickets, no rustling of leaves. The silence was oppressive, like the air had been sucked from the world. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to step out of the car. The moment her feet hit the ground, the smell hit her, rot, decay, like something dead and forgotten for too long. She gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. The wind picked up, and with it, came the whispers. "Help me!" Her heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, searching the empty road, but saw nothing. Just the faint outline of the trees against the night sky. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, a woman's voice, filled with sorrow and desperation. Sarah's breath hitched. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel it now, she wasn't alone. Something was watching her. She turned slowly, and there, just a few feet away, stood a woman. Her figure was shrouded in darkness, but Sarah could make out the torn fabric of a dress, the way the wind seemed to move through her as if she wasn't really there. Her eyes, those eyes, were filled with pain, wide and sorrowful. Fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Please. Help me." The woman took a step forward, and Sarah staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The closer the woman came, the stronger the smell of decay became. It clung to Sarah, sticking to her skin, making her stomach churn. Before she could react, the woman was inches away. The moonlight illuminated her face, and Sarah stifled a scream. The woman's skin was hanging in shreds, her mouth a gaping hole, filled with black, rotting teeth. Her eyes were lifeless, hollow, yet they still seemed to radiate that same desperate "Help me!" Sarah's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the asphalt, scrambling to crawl back toward her car, but the woman was already on top of her, cold hands gripping her shoulders with unnatural strength. Sarah's scream echoed through the night as the woman's face twisted, transforming into something monstrous. Her jaw unhinged, the skin around her mouth tearing as rows of jagged teeth appeared, dripping with dark, viscous blood. With a horrifying wail, the woman lunged forward, sinking her teeth into Sarah's throat. The sound of flesh tearing filled the air, her blood spraying across the pavement in thick, red streams. The woman, Amelia, feasted on her, ripping and tearing as Sarah's body convulsed. Her scream dying in a gurgle, as the last bit of life drained from Sarah, the ghostly woman stood, her figure dissolving into the shadows, leaving only the twisted wreck of Sarah's body behind. Amelia's wrath on highway grew stronger with each passing soul she claimed. The road was littered with blood-soaked memories, twisted wrecks, and the echoes of screams that faded into the night. The haunting whispers continued, forever luring the unsuspecting to their doom, and for Marcus, his torment was eternal. He was trapped in that moment, reliving his own death, feeling the cold hands around his throat, the stench of decay invading his lungs, the weight of his sins crushing him, his screams, just like those of Amelia's other victims, would never leave. "Help me!" Sarah's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the asphalt, scrambling to crawl back toward her car, but the woman was already on top of her, cold hands gripping her shoulders with unnatural strength. Sarah's scream echoed through the night as the woman's face twisted, transforming into something monstrous. Her jaw unhinged, the skin around her mouth tearing as rows of jagged teeth appeared, dripping with dark, viscous blood. With a horrifying wail, the woman lunged forward, sinking her teeth into Sarah's throat. The sound of flesh tearing filled the air, her blood spraying across the pavement in thick, red streams. The woman, Amelia, feasted on her, ripping and tearing as Sarah's body convulsed. Her scream dying in a gurgle, as the last bit of life drained from Sarah, the ghostly woman stood, her figure dissolving into the shadows, leaving only the twisted wreck of Sarah's body behind. Amelia's wrath on highway grew stronger with each passing soul she claimed. The road was littered with blood-soaked memories, twisted wrecks, and the echoes of screams that faded into the night. The haunting whispers continued, forever luring the unsuspecting to their doom, and for Marcus, his torment was eternal. He was trapped in that moment, reliving his own death, feeling the cold hands around his throat, the stench of decay invading his lungs, the weight of his sins crushing him, his screams, just like those of Amelia's other victims, would never leave behind him. The fog had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. But something felt wrong, horribly wrong. His skin prickled, the air inside the truck suddenly cold, so cold that his breath became visible in the dim light, and then he saw her. In the distance, a figure stood in the middle of the road, just barely visible through the fog. Her dress fluttered in the wind, though the air was still. She seemed out of place, her outline hazy, as though she were not fully part of this world. David's heart lurched. A woman? Out here, in the middle of nowhere. He slowed the truck down, his instincts telling him to stop, to see if she needed help. But as he drew closer, something inside him screamed to keep going, to hit the gas and speed past her. His gut churned with dread, his mind replaying the rumors about this very road. Her head lifted, and even through the fog, he could make out her face. Beautiful, once. But now, her skin was pallid, her eyes sunken and rimmed with black. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing dark, bloodied teeth. Her sorrowful eyes seemed to plead with him, pulling him in, making him want to stop despite the terror gnawing at his soul. He slammed his foot on the brake. The truck came to a jarring halt mere feet from where she stood. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't meant to stop. It was as if some invisible force had taken control of his body, forcing him to face her, she began to move, slow and deliberate, her feet dragging a cropping on the window. He forced himself to look. Her face was inches from his, pressed against the glass. Her eyes, God, those eyes, stared into his soul, empty and full of malice. The whispers returned, but this time they were inside the truck, all around him. "Help me," she hissed, her voice a cacophony of the damned. "Help me," David whimpered, his body trembling. He tried to start the truck again, his shaking hands fumbling with the keys. But nothing happened. The cold pressed in on him, seeping into his bones, paralyzing him with fear. The tapping stopped. Her face slowly pulled away from the window, disappearing into the thick fog. David exhaled shakily, his mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Suddenly, the cab of the truck filled with the rancid stench of decay, stronger than before, suffocating him. A low, guttural moan filled the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. His eyes widened in horror as he saw her inside the truck, sitting in the passenger seat beside him, her body twisted and contorted, her head lolling unnaturally to the side as if her neck had been snapped. Maggots crawled from the wounds on her neck, writhing and squirming as they fell into her lap. She leaned closer, her breath foul, the stench of death overwhelming. "You can't leave me," she rasped, her lips barely moving. "No one leaves," David screamed, throwing himself against the door, but it wouldn't open. She was closer now, her skeletal hand reaching out, her fingers brushing against his cheek, cold as ice. The flesh on her hand sloughed off at the touch, revealing bone underneath. "You killed me," she whispered, her voice now soft, almost mournful. It raised as her hand closed around his throat, her grip impossibly strong. He gasped for air, clawing at her, but his fingers passed through her like mist. Her eyes bore into his, those once sorrowful eyes now filled with rage, with the desire to drag him into the depths of her torment. The world around him began to blur, his vision going dark. He could hear her laughter, hollow and cruel, as his consciousness faded. The last thing he saw was her face, twisted into a monstrous smile, before everything went black. Hours later, another car drove down Highway 3, its headlights cutting through the fog. The driver, a young man on his way home from a night out, slowed as he saw the wreck. David's truck was still there, its front end smashed against a tree, smoke curling from the hood. But there was no sign of David. Curiosity got the better of him, and the young man pulled over, stepping out into the eerie quiet. He approached the truck cautiously, the smell of burnt rubber and oil filling the air. But there was something else too, something foul, like rotting flesh. He peered into the cab, expecting to see the driver slumped over the wheel. But it was empty. The seatbelt was still buckled, the keys still in the ignition, but David was nowhere to be found. A cold breeze swept through the trees, and the young man shivered. He turned to leave, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, standing by the side of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights, was a woman. Her dress fluttered in the wind, her hair hanging in loose, tangled strands. Her head was bowed, but as the young man watched, she slowly lifted it, her hollow eyes locking onto his. She smiled. The young man's breath caught in his throat as the woman took a step forward, her figure almost ethereal, the fog wrapping her. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but his feet felt heavy, as if the very air around him had thickened, trapping him in place. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. She was closer now, her face illuminated by the headlights. Her beauty was gone, replaced by the horrors of death, her skin rotting, her eyes sunken and lifeless. And yet, there was something captivating about her, something that made him want to reach out, to help her. Her hand extended toward him, the tips of her fingers blackened and decayed. "Help me." The young man's scream was swallowed by the fog as the highway claimed another soul. The road, ever hungry, waited for its next victim. The legend of Highway 3 grew stronger with each passing death, and the ghostly woman, once beautiful, continued her reign of terror, her sorrowful eyes forever watching, forever waiting. No one escaped Highway 3. The highway stretched endlessly into the night, bathed in an oppressive darkness that felt alive, like a creature waiting to devour anything that ventured too far. The fog wrapped the asphalt in a suffocating grip, and the air carried the stench of something long dead. The moon barely peeked through the clouds, casting a pale, sickly light over the scene. Every inch of Highway 3 was soaked in malevolence, a haunted stretch of road that had claimed countless lives. Amelia's ghost still lingered there, her presence a festering wound on the land. Long ago, she had been beautiful, young, vibrant, full of hope. Her life had been stolen in an instant, a cruel and senseless act of violence on this very road. And now, she waited, her beauty twisted by death, her sorrow transformed into a monstrous need for vengeance. Her murderer had died many years ago, but that hadn't stopped her from punishing those who crossed her path. Her torment was endless, her desire for retribution insatiable. Each traveler who ventured down this desolate highway became a part of her story, dragged into her world of suffering. Tonight was no different. A black sedan sped down the highway, the driver oblivious to the horror waiting just ahead. In the driver's seat sat Julie, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. She'd been driving for hours, trying to outrun the memories of a relationship that had shattered her world. The long, empty road offered her a brief escape from reality, and for a while, she had found comfort in the monotony of the drive. But now, something felt wrong. The air had grown colder, and the fog had thickened to the point where she could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. She flicked on the high beams, but they barely pierced the swirling mist. The car radio, once playing soft, calming music, had given way to static. Julie sighed and reached to adjust the dial, but froze as a voice whispered through the speakers, back, her heart racing. The voice disappeared, replaced once again by the steady hum of static. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. The exhaustion from the long drive was playing tricks on her mind, but then she saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, her figure barely visible through the fog. Julie slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the figure ahead. The woman was motionless, her head bowed, her long dark hair cascading over her face. Instinctively, Julie reached for her phone, but the screen was dead, no signal. Panic set in. What was this woman doing out here? Alone, in the middle of nowhere? The rational part of Julie's brain screamed at her to stay in the car, to drive around the woman and never look back. But something about the woman's stillness drew her in, a strange pull that Julie couldn't resist. She cracked the window slightly. "Hey. Are you okay?" No response. The woman didn't move, didn't react at all. The fog pressed in closer, and the temperature inside the car dropped further. Julie's breath became visible, tiny clouds of warmth that dissipated into the cold. The sense of unease grew, but she felt compelled to get out, to help. She couldn't just leave the woman there, stranded. Julie opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The fog wrapped around her, damp and heavy, clinging to her like a second skin. She shivered, pulling her jacket tight around her body. Every instinct told her to get back in the car, but her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the woman. "Are you hurt?" Julie called again as she approached, her voice trembling. The woman still didn't respond. She stood like a statue, eerily still. As Julie got closer, she began to see details: the tattered dress hanging off the woman's thin frame, the dark stains on the fabric, surely so, like it had been drained of all life. Julie stopped a few feet away. "Hey. I can help you. Do you need a ride?" Slowly, the woman lifted her head, and Julie's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was a grotesque mask of decay. Her once beautiful features were marred by deep, festering wounds, her eyes hollow and sunken, filled with an unfathomable sorrow. Her lips, cracked and bloodied, curled into a twisted smile. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against glass. Julie stumbled back, her mind screaming in terror. She turned to run, but the fog had thickened, trapping her in place. Her feet felt like they were sinking into the ground. The air around her growing dense, suffocating. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring as panic overwhelmed her. Suddenly, the woman was in front of her, impossibly fast, her cold, decayed hand gripping Julie's wrist with a strength that belied her frail appearance. Julie screamed, trying to pull away, but the woman's grip tightened, her nails digging into Julie's flesh, drawing blood. "You can't leave," the woman hissed, her voice now low and menacing. No one leaves. The ground beneath Julie's feet began to shift, and she looked down in horror as the asphalt seemed to melt away, revealing a dark, gaping void. From within, the screams of the damned echoed, their tortured wails filling the air. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque smile, her hollow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Come with me." Julie's body was pulled toward the void, her feet sinking deeper into the black abyss. She clawed at the ground, her fingers scraping against the asphalt, but it was no use. The woman's grip was unbreakable, her strength inhuman. The coldness seeped into Julie's bones, and a sense of overwhelming despair filled her. As she was dragged further into the abyss, Julie's mind flashed with images of the other travelers, those who had met the same fate on this cursed highway. Their faces were twisted in agony, their souls trapped in eternal torment. And now, she would join them. The last thing Julie saw before the darkness consumed her was the woman's face, that haunting smile etched into her decayed features. And then, there was nothing. The next morning, a highway patrol officer drove down Highway 3, his eyes scanning the road for any signs of trouble. It was a quiet stretch, mostly used by truckers and the occasional late-night traveler. But something about the road always made him uneasy. Too many accidents, too many disappearances. He slowed as he approached the spot where Julie's car had been. The black sedan was still there, parked on the side of the road, its driver's side door wide open. But there was no sign of Julie. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his flashlight. He approached the car cautiously, the eerie silence of the highway pressing in around him. As he peered inside, he saw nothing, no blood, no struggle, just an abandoned car. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I've got an abandoned vehicle out on Highway 3. No sign of the driver. Requesting backup for a search." The static crackled on the other end, but before the dispatcher could respond, a cold gust of wind blew through the open door of the car, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Help me." Officer Reynolds froze. He instinctively spun around, scanning the foggy horizon, but saw nothing. The whisper seemed to hang in the air, like a ghostly breath that sent a chill down his spine. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, revealing only the desolate stretch of highway ahead. He called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" His voice echoed, quickly swallowed by the fog. No answer came, only the oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavy in his gut, but years of experience had taught him to keep his composure. He took a deep breath and approached the car again. This time, he noticed something on the seat, faint streaks of blood. His pulse quickened as he pulled out his phone to snap a photo, but his hand trembled slightly. Suddenly, a strange sensation crept over him. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fog seemed to thicken, coiling around him like a predator waiting to strike. Officer Reynolds turned, his breath visible in the frigid air, and what he saw made his blood run cold. in the distance, barely visible through the fog, stood a woman. Her figure was blurry, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way she stood, still. Motionless, like a statue carved from shadow. Her long hair hung over her face, and her dress fluttered eerily, as though caught in a wind that didn't exist. His heart pounded. "Ma'am, do you need help?" He called, but the words felt empty, lost in the void between them. She didn't respond. She simply stood there, waiting. Watching. Instinct told him to get back in the car, to drive away and never look back, but something kept him rooted to the spot. A strange pull, like the weight of her sorrow, tugged at his soul. Against his better judgment, he took a step forward, her head lifted slowly, and he saw her face, or what remained of it. The flesh was pale and decayed, with deep, festering wounds that oozed darkness. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, locked onto his with a gaze that bore into his very soul. A wave of nausea hit him, and a violent shiver crawled up his spine. He staggered back, instinctively reaching for his gun, but his body wouldn't obey. The air around him felt thick and cold, freezing his limbs in place, and then she moved, her steps slow, deliberate, her body gliding across the road as if floating. The ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple with darkness, as if the highway itself was alive, dry, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. His training, his years of experience, none of it prepared him for this. This was something beyond the natural world, beyond anything he had ever known. She was closer now, her decayed face barely inches from his. He could feel the unnatural chill radiating from her body, the smell of death overwhelming. Her lips parted, revealing blackened, bloodied teeth. "You'll stay with me," she whispered, her voice a rasping echo of the damned. "Forever." Reynolds' breath hitched. He tried to move, to run, but it was too late. Her hand reached out, cold as death, gripping his wrist with inhuman strength. He gasped, the icy touch sending a shock of pain through his body. The road beneath him began to shift, the asphalt cracking open like the jaws of a great beast. From the depths, he could hear the tortured screams of countless souls, their wails of agony filling the air, growing louder, more frantic. The ground split wider, a chasm opening beneath his feet, and the fog swirled like a living thing, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the abyss. "No!" he screamed, thrashing desperately, but the pull was too strong. The woman's dead eyes bore into him, her smile widening into something grotesque and unnatural. "You'll never leave," she hissed, and with a final, violent tug, she dragged him into the void. By morning, Highway 3 was quiet once again, the fog dissipating as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The black sedan sat abandoned, just as it had the night before, its driver nowhere to be found. Officer Reynolds' patrol car was still parked nearby, the door left ajar, but he was gone too, swallowed by the road like so many others before him. The highway patrol launched a search for him later that day, but they found no trace. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just two empty vehicles and the ever-present silence. As dusk fell, the fog began to rise once more, curling like ghostly fingers over the asphalt. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft at first, barely perceptible, but growing louder as the night deepened, and in the distance, hidden by the mist, a figure stood on the road, waiting. Always waiting. Highway 3 had claimed another soul, and its hunger was far from sated. The legend would continue, the stories growing darker with each passing year, but one thing remained certain: no one ever left the highway, and no one ever would. Somewhere far away, a young couple drove down a narrow country road, the radio playing softly as they laughed, unaware of the darkness that awaited them just a few miles ahead. They would soon find themselves on a road they didn't recognize, a stretch of highway that wasn't on any map. The woman would appear, her beauty marred by death, her sorrowful eyes pleading for help, and the cycle would begin again, The highway would never be satisfied. It was always waiting.